Thank you. All right. Hello. Well, I would say hello again because we met yesterday, but for those of you I have not met, Ehsan, and thanks for the introduction. As Katerina mentioned, I actually consider myself mostly a discourse scholar, not necessarily a computational social scientist, although I use CSS a lot in my work, right? So I kind of am and am not a computational social scientist, depends on your definition. But Katerina sent me the invitation for this workshop with this question. Like, she basically asked, do you want to do a workshop with the question, does computational social science lack theory? And I love the question, so here I am. But I actually want to start with your answer to the question. So, does computational social science lack theory? Yes, no, what do you think? Or I can just get very quick answers, yes, no, or maybe if you've got any other answers to the question. Somewhere in the middle, yes and no, like maybe. Depends, all right, that's good. Other answers? Is it a yes, it does? It does lack theory? It depends, all right? I wanted to put a maybe there as well. Yeah, I thought it's better to say yes, no. Other answers, yes, no. Pick a side. Yes. Yes.
Like computational studies emerging field, but like from theory, based on that one.
The answer is yes, right? I like that answer actually, yeah. But my answer is basically that the question is not actually the question to ask. It's the wrong question because it's not as easy as you said to say yes, no, or even maybe, or it depends, right? It's a bit more complicated than that. And the real question is not really whether it has theory or not, right? That's the misguiding framing, right? The real question is where the theory is hiding in CSS, right? And the workshop today, or the talk and workshop today, is trying to basically look for that second part, where the theory is hiding in CSS. I'm not trying to defend CSS against theory or the other way around, and the point of the workshop is not really to be a methods workshop or even a theory workshop. It's a middle ground to see how we can combine the two and actually build theory with CSS or use theory in CSS, right? That's the plan for today. But to do that, I need to first provide a very quick overview of the landscape. Some of it you already know based on your readings, based on the keynote sessions and the first couple of days, but it all started with this, right? With an important field-defining article by Laser and colleagues in 2009, titled Computational Social Science, and there they really started to introduce the whole field of computational social science. There was a lot of excitement about data, about we live in a network, we have a lot of data, we need to use computers to analyze all of this, so we are trying to create a field called computational social science. And one very important claim that they make in that article is that they say the current paradigms, by current they mean 2009, are not fit for what we are proposing to do, or for computational social science. They're not receptive to these methods, these the scale of data that we have and everything and so on. So it's year zero, the whole field is born. The field itself is named around its methods. It's computational social science. It's not a new field. And the thing that they see as an obstacle is the exact paradigms that we were using at the time, right? They say theory is an obstacle. Our paradigms are useless. Let's do computational, right? So that's year zero. We move a bit forward in time. Do you all know Gary King? Yep. Is the big name in quantitative methodologies, right? Is basically a quantitative methodologist. In 2017, he writes an article and he basically makes the argument that, well, big data is not about the data, right? He has an ending move in that article, which I really like. He offers a tripartite or a three-legged approach, or basically what he sees as the most productive way forward, right? He says we need three things: statistics and computer science, and the third one, the most quantitative person in the whole field. He says we need substantive theory. And this is 2017, almost 10 years ago. What happens next? Well, the most quant person in the field says we need substantive theory. The whole field moves to build methods and tools and the other two, right? And we keep ignoring the role of theory in the field. Reviewing the past decade of computational social science, then, Laser and a lot of other colleagues in that same article revisit computational social science in that obstacles and opportunities paper. Have you read that one? Yeah. They basically do a stock take of all the progress, all the advancements, all the good things that happened in the field, but they also identify some obstacles in computational social science, right? The first is universities. And actually in the ethics session yesterday, we discussed some of these, which was a welcome question, basically. They say, well, universities do not have the incentives to promote computational social science, etc., etc. They raise some important points about data availability, and they refer to things like Cambridge Analytica and GDPR, and the fact that they have led to lower access to massive amounts of data that we need, and of course the rules and ethics committees and IRBs. And you had a question there that committees kind of hinder computational social science. Laser et al. Make the same claim. So a decade after the field is born, they identify some obstacles, and all problems they see are either institutional or ethical, nothing about theory, right? They don't even see it as an obstacle after, well, 10 years. So it's still missing. There's another paper in the field. Oh, all right. That's a formatting problem. I promise my slides didn't look like that, but there's another paper by Hoffman, Watts, and some others. This is also an important problem, an important article in the field that basically makes some very important contributions in the CSS, right? They make three important moves in this article, right? The first move that they make is that they identify what they call an epistemic misalignment, basically, between social sciences and computational sciences, right? They say social science is all about context and explanation and identifying causality, while computational science is all about accuracy and rigor and prediction. And they see this as not an alignment between two epistemologies, right? That's the first move that they make. The second move is this quadrant model that they introduce, and they kind of categorize what has been happening in the two spaces in 4 quadrants, right? The first 3 are the usual, right? The descriptive studies who are trying to just describe specific things in a fixed world. The second quadrant is when you want to predict specific effects under investigation, like a lot of the supervised machine learning approaches. The third one is explanatory, a lot of social science work, but they identify that fourth quadrant as an empty quadrant that has not happened, what they call integrative. It's the quadrant that they say should happen when those two epistemic traditions actually come together. They converge, and you can explain things under causality rules while predicting something unknown, right? And they identify this as the empty quadrant that has not really happened in social sciences, exactly because, based on their argument, that mismatch between epistemologies, right? They say researchers usually see these two things as opposed while they're not. And it's their third move. So first move was identifying that mismatch. Second move was this classification into quadrants. But the third move that they make is what's the most interesting one for me, right? The third move that they make is that in making these arguments, they put a couple of things aside, right? The first thing they set aside is this sentence in their article that says, our focus here is on empirical modeling activities, not theoretical modeling, such as mathematical and agent-based modeling. So they're putting aside theoretical modeling. And they also say, well, the issue of model interpretability is missing from our framework here because we think that it's just independent of both causal and predictive outcomes and so on, right? So what I find interesting here is that these people here, like Hoffman, Watson, and the rest, are the best people equipped with the tools and knowledge of the field to actually build theory. But what they do is actually, they put it aside, right? They say, okay, we have these quadrants and what we need to do and so on and so forth, but we're just gonna put theory aside, right? And this very, very quick and overgeneralized kind of overview of the field basically gets us to this conclusion, right? That theory building has been a dog that never barks in computational social science, right? That's basically the state of the field. But what I would like to do in this workshop is to argue that this is not really a gap. It's an opportunity for us, right? To say, well, the field has been doing certain things in certain ways. It has left an opening, and we want to target that. That would be basically where this workshop is trying to live, right? In that bracketing that Hoffman and the others did. But before we do that, we need to also address a few things that usually come in this way, right? There are some resistances. Now, when I say resistances, is that these resistances are not necessarily things that one side of the yes-no debate says against the other one. It's arguments from both sides, right? Sometimes it's people who say, yes, computational science, social science lacks theory, because also the ones that say, no, actually we do have theory because, right? But there are 5 tensions, basically 5 camps, and you can categorize them as different understandings of theory, right? This is the first camp that I think majority of us are familiar with, right? This is the range of arguments that comes mostly from people like me, people who are in critical theory, in constructionism, in interpretivist traditions, right? Who basically argue that you cannot really operationalize meaning, right? Meaning is emergent, it's contingent, it's changing all the time. You cannot say this set of phrases indicate meaning making or semiosis or things. As soon as you remove context, you're destroying the exact subject that you're studying, right? So this is the argument that says, if you argue that CSS does have theory, you're just being too generous, right? Because it doesn't, right? Because of that. There's also the other side, right? The argument that says, no, actually we do have theory, but our theory is just formal theory. It's not the, I heard that there was a word fluffy. It's not the fluffy humanities and social science theory that just uses words, right? We have formalized theory. We can predict things. There's a very famous sentence. Who said that? If you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. It's the father of agent-based modeling, Epstein, right? Epstein basically said, who cares about explanation? If you really want to explain something, build it, right? And he developed agent-based modeling. There's another sentence coming from CSS that says, everything is obvious once you know the answer. Who said this one? Watts, the author of one of those papers, like with CSS, right? So this camp basically says explanation is just overrated. It's just a bunch of tweed jacket wearing social scientists with like those patches who want to sound smart. So they build big words and they try to pretend they're doing theory. Just do it, right? That's the computational argument that always resists against theory. There's a third camp. Those of you with, again, humanities backgrounds, philosophy of science, science and technology studies, the argument here is you're all wrong. You can never escape theory, right? From top to bottom, everything you do is theory-laden. As soon as you say sentiment analysis, it involves a theory of what sentiment is, what it shows, how to study it, right? They say all measures, all operationalizations are just theory-laden, right? You can never escape theory. So that's a resistance. And the fourth one is the range of views who say, what theory? Whose theory? Academic rigor or operationalization or trying to make the best predictive model, it's just evasion. We're all dealing with the question of power, right? Our theories, our methods, our tools, our software, our methodologies, they all kind of reinforce certain power relations, right? So they say the question is not question of theory, the question is the question of power or decolonial studies. So these are the 4 loudest resistances, but I mentioned 5, right? The 5th one is, again, the most hidden, most interesting, and most destructive, I would say, resistance is this one, right? You rarely hear people actually say this, but you see the most successful people in the field doing it, right? And it's very ironic. Like the most highly cited, most successful, most prolific writers doing computational social science you rarely find theory in their work, right? Because they say, well, they do not say, but they believe, hey, theory is just overrated. Just do it, right? Did physics wait for us to develop a philosophy of science before doing physics? They just did it, right? Why shouldn't we? And that's the empiricist practitioners or successful empiricist practitioners in the field. I'm sure you know some of them, right? I know I do. All right, so let's see if you have ever seen any of these resistances. Those of you who have submitted journal articles or are doing a longer term project, just say, raise your hand if you've ever received a reviewer A or B comment that says basically, hey, why did you choose this measure or this quantification or this tool? And deep down, you know, you just used it because it was available, right? Or those of you who are doing a project, if you've ever formulated your research questions just because you had access to that data or that method, right? So you had to change your RQ because of data availability or method hype in your university. Has anyone done that? Cool. So this show of hands is not to shame us. I've done both of these, right? It's basically to show that the question of this workshop is not an abstract question. It's a question that you're dealing with on a daily basis, right? It's just phrased in different ways. Now, this assumption that theory is already in your pipeline doesn't resolve the question of what we mean when we say theory, though, right? So theory is like one of those fuzzy words that has all different meanings. But when you go back to criticisms of CSS lacks theory, you usually deal with one of the three layers of theory. The first is the theory of phenomenon, right? Those, oops. It's working, thank you. So the first is theory of phenomenon, right? Those theories like social science theories or humanities theories that try to explain why people do certain things in certain ways, right? That's one layer. There's another layer which is theories of measurement, or when you have theories of a particular methodology, a particular construct, a particular measure, like again, sentiment, right? And there's the theory of method. A lot of us do, I don't know, topic modeling or community detection or social network analysis or unsupervised machine learning, right? All of these methods have a theory behind them because they have an assumption of how we can find communities, right? What a community is and how we can find it. Most of the criticisms of social science, computational social science lacks theory, they actually target that first layer, right? But again, the most lively, important contestation, in my opinion, is those second and third layers, because they are the layers that smuggle theory inside work without us being aware of that, leading to a lot of contradictions, a lot of theory soup, without us being aware of that, right? So if your answer is yes, it does lack theory, you're mostly thinking of that number one, right? But it's 2 and 3 that are the most important one because we all do that. Now a quick activity. I wrote this abstract based on, well, this is me writing this abstract. So it's unreal. It's not in an article, but it is a range of, basically it's an abstract based on a large body of work. I had identified a bunch of things in that body of work. I put them all in the same abstract. I want you to tell me what you think is wrong with this abstract. And it's not one thing, but just read it, and whenever you identify a problem, just let me know. What's wrong is that they're making a claim that there is this thing as affective polarization, while
Well, right here, so in the second sentence, right, you say we ask how negative affect structures online political behavior, but you don't actually explain what you mean. You're missing something like, I argue that this is how this works, and then you go into the
right.
Yeah, that's missing.
That's it. So it's missing because of that prior sentence that argues we are building and growing body of literature. But you're right. They never actually say what they are doing. That's one thing that is wrong. It's a definitional lack based on just masking the theory in just a half sentence, building on a growing literature, documenting rising partisan animosity, right? Which pretends like it's giving a definition of polarization, but it's not doing anything. Just making a claim out of nowhere with no definition. One problem. What else? That that's true. That's true. So the first part is that lack of definition. Yes. The second part, right? So right. So you're basically questioning the whole assumption that affective is something unique to polarization, while we can argue that everything on social media is effective. Good point. I hadn't thought of that actually when I was writing it, but that's a valid point, and that's true. Yes, a theory of affect. It's missing a theory of affect. Is affect something that only emerges in certain things, or is it everywhere, right? And which goes back to the big question of, is affect autonomous or is it posterior? Yeah, exactly. What is non-affective polarization, right? Where do you draw the line? Good point. Yes. Yep. Exactly. It goes from correlation to causation, right? To say, well, we identified that polarized communities are angrier, so it is affective, and like, yeah, it's overgeneralized. Yes. What else? Mhm. Yep, that's the line of, like, theory of affect has two main streams that hate each other. One stream is that stream that says affects are autonomous and a priori, and it's affects first, reactions then, and stuff. The other one is the psychology oriented field who says, like, there's a 2,000ths of a second difference between affects and emotions, and it's all like biological. So, yep. So they don't have a clear theory of affect. That's true. Yep.
Yep. This doesn't count as them being theoretical, building
Yep.
and growing.
That's the theoretical part. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's a large gap that they are trying to evade, kind of. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So if we take all the other criticisms as valid, the next step is exactly that you looked at the wrong problem in the wrong place using a wrong assumption, And now you're suggesting solutions based on all those wrong assumptions. So we can say your solution will go horribly wrong, right? That's true. Like that intervention comes out of nowhere. Good. What else? You're destroying a whole field now, but yeah, I love it. I can talk for days about affective polarization, but this particular abstract, let's see what else you find. You've identified layer 1 problems. Now I want to push you to think of layer 2 and 3, theories of measurement, theories of method. Do you see any indications there? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Would it help if it was over a 6-month or 6-year period? It would be better? Right. Let's say it's a 6-year period and 420 million tweets. Now think of the theories of measurement and method, and still something is wrong. But that's a good point. That's a very short period to look for. But let's say it wasn't that short. There's something more problematic there. Not problematic, but that sense that I mentioned, theories of measurement and method, a theory is smuggled in there without showing any awareness. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's exactly the theory of measurement and method that goes wrong. That I mentioned, the theory is hidden there, right? The measurement here is we construct a network of users connected by retweets and detect ideological communities, right? So the theoretical assumption there is that retweeting equals ideological communities, right? That's a theory smuggled in there. That's a theory of community, right? Without actually that theory finding any particular space, right? The other one is measuring each community's affective intensity using a validated emotion lexicon, right? Again, that says that words can operationalize affects or emotions, right? That sentiment equals emotion equals affect. You can really question that, right? Maybe, maybe not, but these are all theories smuggled in without having basically investigated them, right? And then we go to this part that basically reverses cause and effect, because you can make an equally valid argument that it's not that angrier means more affective polarized. It could be the other way around, right? Because they're polarized, they're angrier, right? It's not that they're angrier so they are polarized. It could be exactly the other way around. Maybe you're reversing cause and effect there, right? These are all smuggled in theories of method or like community detection. Does it really detect communities just because it says I am community detection algorithm Louvain or something? Good. So we spent some time identifying some of the smuggled in commitments in others' work. Now I want to ask you to do it for your own work, right? Wherever you're sitting in like groups of 3 and 4, I'd like you to spend some time doing 2 things, right? One is to think of whatever you're doing as part of your research, PhD, a mini project, whatever you're doing, right? Think of those 5 resistances, see which one you might have the hardest time responding to if someone raises that resistance against your work, right? And think of the methods and tools that you're using, then go one layer deeper, think of what theoretical commitments they're smuggling in, and is it a theoretical commitment that you would agree with and endorse, or that you were not aware of, right? I'll give you about 10 minutes. It may not be enough. It's definitely not enough, but I don't want the answers now. I want questions to basically get you thinking. The formal theory, it's basically what agent-based modeling and some of the computational models do. That it's a theory that explains how certain things move from A to B to C to D without trying to explain why, right? Or a big theory of how society works or why people do things, right? The formal theory is basically that we are individual agents. We take actions based on that agency. So if these are the parameters, this is the prediction, these kinds of things. So spend some time, groups of 3 or 4, discuss your own work, think of the resistances, think of your theoretical commitments in the pipeline, especially in theories of method and measurement, not theory of phenomenon. I'll come and listen and have a chat and see where we get to, right? 10 minutes, almost.
That's which of the 5
I think
answer first?
What do you think? You do something I think that's what I Ehsan in life. I remember it. You do something about media, right? And I
Let me just solve the question. If we should apply this point, I get the question. Yeah, also like AI strategies, AI management plan. Those are really change into document. That's the illustrate how they so because I'm here training and yeah, called train for me that I need to so I'm all the frames I can deconstruct with like frame dimensions. So it's like a big aspect theory of like your frame dimensions, what is the problem what's the causal attributions, what is the model evaluation, and what is the kind of like so like I deconstruct it and then ask LLM separately. And I measure their agreement outputs. So while they are not like exactly matching like the overarching concept that they mentioned, conceptually are very similar. So based on this conceptual I then kind of like consolidate them in like pros and cons of like are what are these kind of the overarching top level frame elements, which are then construct into like top level frame. So based on that, I think the problems
but I think
right? Because it's very automatic, like the instruction. Now we give it like the same profit.
if you do it's all right.
It's not the same, but they can be different. Like this difference variation, it's important, right? Yeah, yeah, mostly coding, right? But the main question I think I'll get is the is that way that stay objective. Do I do a good job of explaining what I mean by this theoretically, right?
I think you were trying to do everything there, you know?
Sorry?
I feel like you were trying to do everything.
Several things, yeah. Yeah. So,
So theory based on
yes. So,
dimension.
basically, like, imagine you go to I can see it, and then you explain first what you mean by all of these elements, and then why you do this, and then extract all these elements for you. While trying to make it less chaotic and dynamic and also just temporary. But so that's what I'm doing now. And then I also ensure that I validate this outputs, like I stay in control of the attention. So one thing I think, I don't know which school or five resistances is like connected, but I look back some of the questions that ask me, like, especially for the academia, like splitting into like,
Yes, that to be, it seems to me that you have to operationalize theories. You operationalize, like, explain it, but now you explain it to the computer sort of determination. Yes, I think it's a tool, and the thing is, like, there's a bit of random state there. Where the thing actually changed from company behind it, they changed from an icon as a assistant to me. Plot, they changed from they just you like?
Yeah, all different, yeah, they're all producing different outputs. So I use or something like no, it's not so it's like it's not the same thing, but that's where you have to step in and like make sense of it as a researcher, right? Yeah.
Interesting. I don't know if there's a thing that you actually do an explore library, right? But also explain it to a computer agent. And the computer agent gives something to you. It's a very different process. Like what you think like.
So this is like a contribution like that I'm thinking of is more of an instrument. So theoretically, I'm producing theoretically
exactly, depending on
it's not more, but it's a bit more developed in terms of how you may personalize this element for this theory that I'm talking about. There's so many different theories of programming because it's like in media and people design they talk of different things, equivalence claims, all that stuff.
Dimension you mean this some kind of theory?
Yeah. I'm using like all elements are related to one theory that I'm talking. This was back in 1993, and people are still debating, but you know, it's you know, people still trying to go in different platforms and stuff, but.
What the contribution is so like how you it's like it's almost like because you would have articles part of the article you would have a table you break down dimensions into a very almost like plain language.
Yeah, that's
and you the operationalize that means have some key element the computer sort of understands the key element makes that up and thing. So you have word cloud something and almost like check this.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Like, this can be a useful instrument, and that's because I'm thinking about the frames. AI techniques. This can be done inductively, and it can be applied to many other documents that we're analyzing.
Policy development.
Not policy, like news, and then, like because these problems that are not like using asks for theoretically driven tasks. You're not like asking it to produce AI today. You're asking it to just look at software and give me all these elements.
So
Which are then I already like systematically kind of like control, systematize in a way, and then I make sense of it. And also maybe have this work as simple as possible so that others can use it.
Yeah,
It's a scalable thing, right? If you have lots and lots of things, and what else to produce? Yeah, it's kind of like. That says theory should wait. We can't wait for theory. Okay, so maybe I have that. Not that maybe I have because I'm saying like you can listen to maybe I should go back and think about theory. Right.
Otherwise, you can keep it all things. It's like what do you think is an objective?
Objective or not? I think it's just a big question. Like even if we think about humans, right?
Yes,
if you have human homes, expert human homes, right? You say, but are they objective or something?
No.
Right? I think it's not a wrong question, but it's a bit redundant in a way because models with the capabilities nowadays, models can be as objective because there are some as experts. Yeah. So we have different like the different functionality. Yeah. So what about you? Yeah.
We may argue about it later. I think for me, it's about I sort of try to operationalize theory of disability because I'm not understanding really how my thesis is about humanist, humanity, purpose, but I think the challenge is like it's lived experience, so theory was also quite open. I think maybe the thing that was to me was like multidimensional experience. Just before they sort of defined model, they moving to something else. They moving to experience like that which living as a person in the category of disability.
I was saying to them is that because my background is in psychology, I find it actually hard to answer it because meaning can be but I guess that's an assumption in
I'm just focusing on one
scale that I'm in the discipline we have to, but that I understand that is can be an issue as well. Yes, one of them that we were saying. Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that's part of the abstract because I felt like I knew what you were asking to measure and I looked at the numbers because that's a functional conversation, but everything else is the math measure. That's good enough. Yeah. I was like, of course, that's what I want to say.
How can you experience social media, right? Do you have to be, as an observer, do you have to actually be there present in person to observe?
Yeah, that's, I'm hearing that now. Yeah, it's very complex.
Yes, like that. These are the questions that maybe you I mean, you don't have to answer them.
What seems
yeah, it's just
it goes too fast.
And
also when they
what did you find like I'm mostly interested in theoretical commitments that
yeah, no, I think I think we just met like
Right now, I don't have so much time.
right?
I mean, like, we just go back to your example. I feel like I might need to fall my memory there. Yeah.
I'm trying
Tell you
to.
one of them is
That's exactly how it works.
generate code, generate answers.
Doing it with means
Typically, each one. So we actually
sometimes it's.
Maybe those questions that say we both right.
from one person, take one month.
You have to
So the next question is how to create
Experience.
It's like.
That's just one way. Right now, I think that's.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It was a great chat and great questions raised. So I'll probably give a very quick recap of what I found out, and pretty much all groups got to exactly the type of question that I was hoping you would get at, right? Which is, we are using a range of methods. Sometimes these methods come from different disciplines who have different assumptions and may not work together, but we kind of have to work with that method because the method itself is valid. It's just that the theory behind it may not be applicable to our line of work, right? So the next question is, if I'm using 5 methods and they come with 5 different theories and those theories do not match, what should I do, right? So, big, difficult question, and a question that I was dealing with, I would say, for the past 10 years or so. So how can we actually build theory with CSS if we are in this kind of situation? We've got solid methods, solid techniques, solid tools, a lot of solid theories, but we cannot put them all together, right? I'll provide an answer from my own work with the caveat that what I'm proposing is not the way or the best way, it's just my way, right? The principles that I took out of this, I would argue that are applicable in all types of work that we do in this room, right? So you don't need to basically take this as the answer, but the general approach, right? As Katerina basically mentioned in the introduction, since 2013, my research has always been on, at the most basic level, disagreements between people on social media, right? Why do people disagree? How do they disagree? And how can we transcend these disagreements, right? So when we say polarization, at its most simplified, basic understanding, it's just people disagreeing, right? Based on all sorts of things. So I deal with questions of, well, people having ideologies, identities, discourses, but also platforms and the way they're designed, etc., etc. I had to go back to the main binaries and dichotomies in social sciences and humanities, right? There's always a question of primacy of structure versus agency. And that's a big gap between disciplines who believe that structure is a priori and shapes behavior, or disciplines that say it's agency, right? Like psychology, is the agency camp. Marxism is the structure camp, right? There's also the question of discourse versus materiality. Which one is priori, right? Is it discourse that shapes everything, or is it the material that shapes discourse? Which comes first? Is it the chicken or is it the egg? But when you deal with social media or digitally mediated communication in general, you kind of see all the 4 at the same time, all the time. You can never draw the line, it's this one or it's that one, right? You always see all of them. You deal with the platform and its design and features and affordances and moderation and algorithms and its creators and their ideologies. You have a bunch of users with different agencies and identities and discourses. You then have structures on the platform, among the groups on the platform, in the society, in the world, economy, education. So I was trying to kind of find a way to work with all of these without falling into a reductive trap of saying it's all discourse. So I cannot say that, right? I can have all the discourse I want, but if the platform shuts my account down, I don't have any voice to say, right? So it's not just my discourse then, it's also the materiality of the platform or the structures or power relations or who the platform shuts down and who they allow to talk to, right? So they're always together at the same time. In my background, basically, I always, as I said again in my introduction, I always see myself as a scholar of discourse because that's all my previous training, right? And among all the competing theories of discourse, I found one, the most satisfying for my types of questions, the discourse theory of Lacan-Move, right? So it's one of the theories of discourse that argues that meaning is never fixed, it's contingent, it's antagonistic, all meaning is based on the difference with all the other possibilities of meaning. Meaning is always changing. It's a radical materialist theory, but socially constructionist. And it would help me explain discourse at all levels, right? But there's one very big thing missing in discourse theory. It was developed in 1980s, before social media, before anything. And like Lacan-Move spent so much time focusing on the discourse that they forgot altogether about the material. In their theory, they never engage with material, right? And material agency and things. So what I needed was a theory of the material, right? Because I could use this theory to explain a lot of the stuff that is said or done online, but I could not use discourse theory about the platform and material relations in the society and so on and so forth, right? So I had to basically go and do a deep dive in literature on material agency, which took me basically to two big traditions. One is the tradition that is generally referred to as new materialism. Is anyone using new materialism? Karen Barat, Harman, Meyasu, Haraway, these ones, like, yep, you are using the Haraway. Oh, right, yeah, cool. So there is a range of scholars who are generally referred to as new materialists who argue for something called the ontological turn, to basically go back to the big metaphysical questions of ontology and try to show why the material has agency, right? Very abstract philosophical work. Then there's science and technology studies. And in science and technology studies in particular, there is theories of Bruno Latour, actor network theory, that has a very comprehensive vocabulary of dealing with material agency, right? And a lot of work in STS draws from Latour's work, right? So I looked into Latour's work and found a very good and useful point of convergence between discourse theory and actor network theory, exactly because they're both social constructionists, right? So they do have assumptions that fit while they diverge very extensive divergences between the two, right? But actor network theory has its own massive problems for a social scientist, right? Although it is a social science methodology and theory, it does a few things to solve some contradictions that I find highly problematic and limiting, right? The first thing it does is what it says, a flattening of ontology, right? It says we are not dealing with human actors and material actors, we are dealing with actants. Both humans and material have agency, they do things, and they're equal, right? So it flattens the ontology to fix some contradictions or theoretical coherences. I find that problematic just because it doesn't then have the vocabulary to deal with hierarchies and power relations and historicity and context.
It basically,
Yes, so the main argument is that agency is the capacity to do. And yes, then whoever or whatever is doing the action is an actant, right? So an example is, the example that I use in my book is actually to kind of challenge actor network theory, is that the main argument is when a car is driving and it hits a stone and it stops, the stone did the act of stopping, right? So we can say the stone has agency. That I agree with, but the flattening of ontology that equates human agency and material agency and all sorts of material agency, I do not agree with, right? Because the example I use is a rock, a boom gate, and a traffic light all stop a car, but they do it in different ways, right? One is just physics, one is physics, but we put it there. One is totally discursive. The traffic light itself does not have the power to stop the car. It's the discursive power. And we have put it there, right? So it's different forms of material agency. So I needed to kind of find a way to combine the two without falling into these contradictions, right? What I did basically was then use discourse theory as my spine, the thing that I would not change because I find it very coherent. I draw from actor network theory, but I do not accept its assumptions, right? So I borrow the vocabulary, but I modify it to avoid the theory soup, right? That's why I cannot say I'm doing discourse theory, and I cannot say I'm doing actor network theory. I'm doing something new, which I call discursive digital analysis, right? That's why I had to actually give a name to this whole new social ontology, right? Because I also didn't want to go to ontology because I find it too abstract. So I argued for an ontological return. Now, the point is not to go into the theory that I developed. The point is the principles that you can take out of it, right? Because I don't expect you all to do discourse analysis, but there are some principles. The first is importing a theory comes with its own commitments, right? You either accept them, work with them, or drop them, or adapt them, right? To adapt them, you do need a spine. So you do need a main theory or a main theoretical framework, because then if something doesn't fit the main theoretical framework, you either drop it, or change it, right? You can use a method for its methodness, but you can question its assumptions, unless you can never separate them, right? If you say a bag of words does carry meaning, then you cannot say, I don't know, I'm going to use a bag of word topic modeling approach, but I question the assumption, because then if the whole method works with bag of words, you kind of have to accept the preceding assumption, right? So that's the first principle. In a lot of work, you actually see that no spine thing. I would argue there's no such thing, right? You can pretend there's no spine, but all you're doing is actually hiding the theory, which leads exactly to those contradictions that we were discussing, right? Where you bring in several methods with their theoretical commitments that do not work together, right? That's the contradictory theory soup that I always see in a lot of academic literature in our field, right? It's just because they never engage with the theory, the theoretical spine. They just bring in everything without examining the theoretical commitments, right? So that's why I always say, think of the theoretical commitments embedded in the methods and tools, right? Because you want them to work together. Now, this was the abstract level of things. I can take it a bit further and use one of the case studies that we did with Katerina, Dom, that you met, and a few other colleagues, which also found its way in the book and a journal article. It was a study where we were interested in looking at political communication, of course, on Reddit. So we had the chance to collect 16 years of posts and comments from 11 big political subreddits, right? Gave us about 7 million posts, 200 million comments. It's big, at least at the scale of data that I usually analyze, it's very big, right? At the scale of the data that some of you deal with, it's just tiny, right? But for the kind of work that I usually do, it was big data. And it's enough to make everyone excited in computational social science, right? It's 200 million comments. It's like, wow, I can do all sorts of things with it. But because it was big, we had to do a lot of work, right? So we developed a kind of stack, right? Which is basically the principle that you do. At the top of this layer is, of course, all the theory-heavy questions, like the context, the fact that Reddit is US-based, that a lot of political communication in those subreddits, although they're not American subreddits, is very US-heavy, about the fact that Reddit has its own moderation layer, but then subreddits have their own moderation layer. What you can do in a subreddit, you can upvote, downvote, comment, reply, well, reply, not comment, right? You can share URLs, etc., etc. We also had to deal with a lot of theories or middle range theories that could explain certain parts of this whole environment that we were looking at, right? We had to activate theories based on need, right? Like theories from information flows, collective identity, spiral of silence, some from psychology, some from political science, some from sociology. And because it was a large team and it was a very large data set, we had to also use a lot of different tools and methods, right? We did NLP and BERT topic modeling, social network analysis, different kinds of community detection, different kinds of computational text analysis, corpus linguistics. We had, what else did we do? Did we do LEDA? No, we didn't. We just used BERT, yeah. We had to extensively use Python libraries and Gephi and Tableau and AntConc, which is a corpus linguistics software, right? The thing that helps us solve those soups and contradictions was that synthesis layer, right? That spine. Because we took the methods based on their value of doing things, not their assumptions, right? The assumption, or what helps us synthesize and interpret the findings, was that theoretical spine, the entanglement of the discursive and the digital or material, right? So it wasn't basically that we were blindly and without question applying all sorts of methods and theories. The method just outputs a partition of the data, right? What it means, that's a theory, right? That's a theoretical interpretation that comes in the synthesis layer. The method itself can never show you what it means, what the output means. The interpretation of the output is theory, and to do that, well, you need a theoretical spine, right? The example I use here is most of us do community detection, usually in Gephi, Force Atlas 2, in elsewhere Louvain, right? Yes, it gives you a partition of the data, it gives you a cluster, but your answer to whether that cluster is just random noise, or if it's a digital public, or if it's a community of practice, or a discursive identity, or ideology, or friends, or a group, or a crowd, or a social, or a collective, these are all theoretical interpretations, right? Other than that, it's just a bunch of nodes and edges. It's just an output, right? The algorithm doesn't know what the nodes and edges are. It just calculates the number, modularity maximization, blah, blah, and it spits out a cluster. What it means, that's your theoretical interpretation and the spine that your theory has, right? Now, it's not as easy though. Whenever I promise something, I need to also talk about the dangers threatening the whole field and the practice. I think there are a few dangers and pathologies in not just computational social science, but in humanities and social science of today in general. The biggest one is this, right? Academia in general has become neoliberalized, which basically incentivizes speed. Do things fast, publish, get citations, get promotions, go to conferences, publish the next thing, right? Which also means that we jump from hype to hype, right? 8 years ago, it was all big data. What was the next hype? It was disinformation, fake news. What was the next one? Oh, that there was one bit after that, polarization. After that, it's LLM and AI, right? Soon it will be AGI and so on and so forth, right? We just move from hype to hype without even examining things. It's fast, it's speed that is incentivized, not depth, right? Which has also meant that there is an incentive for having a personal brand. That trademark that we are going to be known by, which basically means 10 people working on the same thing, writing 10 articles, giving it 10 different names, right? I study digital publics, right? I've got a collection of all the different publics theorized. Right now I'm at 26, right? So there are 26 different words for different forms of publics, right? And I have counted 15 types of polarization in the literature. Some are exactly synonymous. It's just two different words for the same thing, right? Just because of that personal brand, which creates confusion, right? And it creates noise without depth. But the two more worrying dangers are that in CSS, we very often, that's the question we started with, right? We very often comfortably let the API or the method or the tool to set the ontology of our research, right? Exactly because we don't question the unexamined commitments. We just say, well, what I can collect is this, so I'm going to ask that, right? And we just do because we need to be fast, right? And there's a fetishization of empiricism, but not all kinds of empiricism, because empiricism is good. It's where we find all the answers that we need. It's a particular type of empiricism, which I call empiricism of presence, borrowing from Derrida's metaphysics of presence, right? It boils down to this, basically, that in computational social science, we focus on the present because we must, right? And what it means, we basically look at what we can collect and just analyze that. We don't care about the rest, right? Whenever I raise this criticism, I usually get one of the two responses from colleagues. You can't collect a non-tweet, right? Or, but we're doing observational studies. Both are valid, right? Both are correct. You cannot collect a non-tweet. And we are doing observational studies, but we could observe other things, right? The thing that has happened, and going back to my first paper from Laser, a whole field is named after its methods, right? And what it has done is that we have replaced the structures with the methods, right? All we care about is the methods and doing things fast, not the underlying dynamics. I'll go back to the Reddit study that we did. 11 subreddits, 16 years, hundreds of millions of posts. The biggest and oldest political subreddit is R Politics, right? It's got 8.5 million members. And in our data set, we had 170 million comments and 4 million posts or something. But it all comes from less than half of the users in that subreddit, right? In 16 years, 52% of members of our politics did not post a single word, not a single word, right? It's just complete absence and complete silence, right? Now, this is not something you can just put in a footnote and say, hey, the limitation is these numbers are, you cannot trust. When you start to observe the non-acts, you actually see that that silence is highly patterned. It's not just a feature of our politics. When you look at patterns of silence across all the 11 subreddits, you see differences where conservative users are silent in different ways. Progressive users are silent in totally different ways, right? Less than I'm just going by memory now, but conservative users were less silent, progressive users were more silent, right? Something like that. So the silence is structured, it's patterned, it's something to observe. But we were salivating with that 200 million comments, right? We were like, wow, we need to analyze what these comments say. You could easily miss what they don't say, what they don't do, what these 4.5 million users did not do in 16 years, right? That's something to observe that empiricism of presence disincentivizes because it's just hard. It takes time to study silence, right? And you cannot statistically show these things easily because to explain silence, you need a theory that can deal with silence, right? That's another reason for why theory is needed. You do need a theory that identifies the agency of passivity, agency of silence, right? So going back to that abstract, in all the flaws that we found, the biggest flaw for me is actually that empiricism of presence, right? It looked at anger because it was easy to collect and easy to do sentiment analysis on, and then it concludes that polarization is fundamentally effective. It looked at something that manifests in a certain way, and it concludes about underlying conditions. So it says, well, this looks like polarization, so we're polarized, right? It's polarization as illusion versus polarization as manifestation versus polarization as condition. The real question there is why, or is the underlying structures that are polarized, is all the silences, all the frustrations, all the words that people could say but don't, and so on and so forth. So we're almost at time and almost at the end of this. Having talked for a long time, I basically hope there are two real takeaways from this workshop, right? One is to be friends with theory, right? Theory-driven CSS is not a tax on empirical work. You can still do your empirical work, but you could be driven by theory because that allows you to see more of things, right? And the sentence that I said to one of the tables, theory basically helps you know where to look when the data stops, when the data becomes quiet. When you've analyzed all those 200 million comments, theory tells you, hey, you can look at the non-comments too, right? Something like that. Or you can provide arguments for why there are structured silences in this data set. That's my hope for key takeaway one. And the second one is the answer that I start to the question I started with. Does CSS lack theory or not? I would say no, it doesn't lack theory. Theory is all around in all the tools and methods and assumptions that we use. The question is that in general, CSS has left its theories load-bearing and unexamined, implicit, right? Not showing an awareness of the theories behind the methods and tools that we use, right? So the point is not really to defend CSS against theory or theory against CSS. The point is exactly how to build theory with CSS and how to drive CSS informed by theory, right? That's pretty much what I wanted to get at in this workshop. Thank you. some minutes.
Would anyone like to start?
And don't ask hard questions.
If not, I can start first with a non-hard question. Did you experience any resistance from any sort of, I guess, camps, especially when combining theories, right, or borrowing from another theory? Have you had someone tell you that you can't do that?
Well, you get that all the time, basically, because as soon as you say theory, you need to deal with the two top layers of that, right? The epistemology and ontology. So before you get that question, you always need to think about it in advance. Actually, if you want to combine theories, do their ontologies match or not? And do their epistemologies match or not, right? That's why I basically mentioned that I did not find the neo materialism useful, right? Because it's too abstract, too metaphysical, and it makes ontological arguments that do not match the ontological realities, right? It equates a stone with Donald Trump. They have the same agency, right? Which doesn't work like that, right? So you do get that if you're careless, but if you're careful enough to basically investigate those ontological differences, you can do certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I guess I wanted to somehow mention or say something interesting, probably, hopefully interesting. Something that I experienced myself. So I did my PhD in a computer science department. Of course I did. Political science department. And we had these bi-weekly sessions. So we would invite different speakers from different universities to visit us. And there was a person from QUT, both of you know him well. I'm not gonna tell you who he is. kind of telling, right? I mean, and he visited us, and he had this great presentation about Twitter and then extracting data from Twitter posts and visualizations and graphs and frequency, and then word frequency analysis, and then something about discourse analysis. And after the presentation, I asked my research supervisor, well, what do you think? What do you think about this? What do you think about all this work? I personally think it's amazing, because I was really excited about all these methods, because it's something new. We all attracted to all these shiny things, right? And then my supervisor told me, well, it's so, sorry, bullshit. Where's the theory? Where's the research question? Why are we doing this? Why do you need any of these methods if they don't really explain anything? Could you please open it? And then he was really uninterested in this, and I felt kind of like he kind of had a point. So you've got all these methods, you got LLMs, you got all the stuff, you got the things you observe, right? But without a theory, you cannot really tell what you observe, and then you cannot really tell what kind of questions you are answering, I guess, what kind of problems you are addressing, what you're solving, and then whether your solution is actually correct. Because without supporting set of assumptions that you actually have, you cannot really use any of these observations in a meaningful manner. So that's what made me think. I'm just wondering whether you share the same sentiment, and then whether you've encountered any conflicts.
I 100% agree, and I would probably add that yes, exactly. And like again, in that line of, for instance, polarization research, one of the biggest problems is that exactly because of that symptom-oriented approach in the field to say what we can see and take it from there to polarization, there has been one of the biggest conceptual sins in humanities and social science. It's Sartori's concept of conceptual stretch, right? You now read papers that say, hey, polarization can also be positive. So polarization is a range from people wanting to kill each other to people just disagreeing, right? Without distinguishing it, well, isn't that just disagreement? Or isn't that fragmentation? Or isn't that just social identity? Or isn't that just theories of public sphere or so on and so forth, right? When you don't have theoretical definitions of concepts, you can just study anything and call it anything, because you can basically drive the methods to take you where you want, right? So I absolutely agree with that. That theory, the role of theory is exactly that. And the point is not to say there's only one theory that is the right one. It's to be transparent and explicit that I'm using this definition, I'm operationalizing things this way, I'm using this method this way, and this is what I find, right? Because that's when a scientific conversation can start. That's when we can question each of those constructs to basically say, okay, but I do not agree with your assumptions, and then we can start a discussion. While when we keep everything fuzzy and non-defined and non-explainable, everybody is right and nobody's saying anything meaningful, really. So, yeah, totally agree with that. And I do agree that there's sometimes a concentration of certain approaches that we may not really agree with in different parts of academia, like all the disciplinary wars and everything. So, yeah, that's...
And it's also a definitional issue. If you don't have a supporting theory,
yeah,
and you adopt a definition, everyone can basically adopt any kind of definition for any phenomenon, right? And then they wouldn't be wrong in their own way, but ultimately, if there is no foundation, if there is no theoretical assumption underneath on which you build these definitions, I guess your research then is not that really meaningful after all. It's just meaningful to you.
True, yeah. True.
And your friends, but otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Totally agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm quite surprised at myself when I get into a bit theory during the PhD. Is before I was a bit more techno person. Like I would like playing out with a tool. My question for you is like, what do you think if we are moving towards more postmodernism? Like we moving beyond binary also, because in your work there's a bit of agency versus something and materialist. What if we move into there's no sort of way to just pinpoint that thing along the spectrum? And I think the next part of the question, maybe we will need a bit of more longer conversation for that, because I do believe in flat ontology though. I do believe in the actual network theory. This is no particular one more powerful than the other. It's all combined thing. So yeah. But yeah.
You asked both questions from someone with their own biases. In terms of post-structuralism, postmodernism, I cannot say it's bad, because I do use a lot of post-structuralist theory. So yes, but also not super fuzzy, right? Like there is a easy, lazy representation of post-structuralist theories that is like it's all relative, like everything is contingent. Let's move on, right? That's the lazy one. That's the misrepresentation of the arguments, right? That's why actually every philosopher labeled as postmodernist has disagreed with the label, because the whole idea is that you cannot have that classification, right? There is also the ontological and epistemological claims underneath why we cannot have that fixed meanings, which I absolutely agree with, right? That the whole idea of contingency, that any meaning, any signification comes with exclusion of all other possible meanings, right? So that's my starting assumption with my research. So I cannot say it's a bad thing because I do it all the time, but I'm biased because I do it, right? Other people would say postmodernism is just utter nonsense, right? Which, well, that's a valid point, right? The actor network theory thing probably needs a longer discussion, but the thing that doesn't work for me is exactly that flattening, right? That they are actants, they are both equally agents, but their type of agency, its implications and its power and hierarchy is very different, and actor network theory doesn't have the vocabulary for that, right? I can use an example from Slavoj Žižek in response to that, right? Slavoj Žižek has this very interesting footnote that says, if you agree with that kind of epistemology of like flat ontology where everything is correct, and I'm sorry, it's a very triggering example, it's that the concentration camps themselves and the furnaces were as equally guilty as the Nazi regime and soldiers, right? So you're basically misplacing responsibility by saying, hey, the algorithm did this, right? It's equally agent. It escapes responsibility. While humans, because of signification, we are more responsible for our actions, right? Or completely responsible for our actions, I would say. Yeah. That's my problem with ANT, because it's too flat, and Latour insists on radical empiricism. It's like these questions are just irrelevant. Everything is just flat, just follow the actors, right? But it follows them at the time. It never looks at the past. It never looks up and down. It just looks horizontal flatness, which I don't buy, right?
Much, Ehsan. Ehsan will stay with us just for the morning tea. And so if you have any questions to ask him about theory or computational methods or how he uses Claude in his teaching and research, please find him and talk to him. Thank you again, Ehsan, for this wonderful presentation. Let's join me in thanking Ehsan.